By the 1930s, after 200 years of struggles, interspersed with revolutions, defeats, as well as political and social breakthroughs, European workers were all aware of belonging to one single class. But this working class was more split than ever. Whereas in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, they were forced into silence and impotence, in the parliamentary democracies, they became a real political force. Spurred on by the apparent success of the Soviet Revolution, the working classes believed more than ever in a brighter future.
Debout les damnés de la terre, debout les forçats de la faim. La raison tonne en son cratère, c'est l'éruption de la faim.
In 1932, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the death of Karl Marx, militant communists, filmed by Joris Evans, marched with raised fists through the mining villages of Borinage in the southwest of Belgium. This gesture of defiance and anger first appeared in a cartoon by George Gross in a homage to revolutionary fighters who died in Berlin in 1919. Initially adapted by German communists, the raised fist spread rapidly throughout Europe and over the next 50 years became the symbol of a politically belligerent working class. In France in 1936, it flourished at the time of the Popular Front's election victory, in which radicals, socialists, and communists were united. 12,000 factories and offices went on strike throughout the country, 9,000 of which were occupied by workers. Up to then, no other industrialized country had experienced a movement of such size or duration. The national strike was one big revolutionary party. The 48-hour week was set alight. Effigies of employers hanged. Even so, negotiations also took place on practical measures, such as working hours, work rates, and the disastrous effects of streamlining. After 3 weeks, the strikers had won. A working week of 40 hours, paid holidays, and collective bargaining agreements all brought about enduring changes to working conditions. Historian Marion Fontaine.
L'entre-deux-guerres, et à la limite jusqu'aux années 50-60, c'est vraiment le temps de l'aliénation ouvrière par excellence, le temps où on peut de moins en moins croire à ce qu'écrivait Karl Marx, c'est-à-dire que le travail sera libérateur de l'existence humaine. C'est-à-dire que vous pouvez changer de régime, vous pouvez même abolir le capitalisme, le travail industriel dans les grandes usines automobiles, il demeure aussi aliénant. Donc la question, c'est comment vous faites ? Le gouvernement du Front populaire est peut-être l'un des premiers gouvernements à se trouver vraiment face à ce problème. Les congés payés, la politique des loisirs, c'est une forme de réponse, qui est aussi un constat d'impuissance, qui est de dire, bon, de toute façon, on ne transformera pas le travail. En revanche, on peut faire en sorte que les droits des ouvriers soient respectés dans le cadre de ce travail, donc qu'il y ait de la démocratie sociale, que le patronat négocie, etc. Et on peut compenser en offrant aux ouvriers aliénés dans le cadre des usines des espaces où ils peuvent se libérer.
The Popular Front has stayed in the collective imagination as being one big party. It's perhaps the only moment in history where there are pictures of happy workers, if you don't count the images of German and Soviet propaganda. But the parties and celebrations weren't just a passing carnival. They helped to remind the bosses that the factories were not their private houses, nor workers their children, and that the workers didn't expect the boss's blessing, nor did they owe the bosses any allegiance. From now on, blue-collar work belonged in the public space, not the private. And even if the workforce knew that party time would soon be over, they also knew that nothing would take their newfound freedom from them. Finally, it was back to work. In one provincial factory, in order to be taken on again, the workers had to copy out and sign a letter, which said a lot about the backward-thinking mentality of the French employers at the time. We apologize for having behaved badly towards you by going on strike. We ask for your forgiveness, and taking us on again will enable us to make it up to you by being irreproachable from now on. In July 1936, barely a month after the French Popular Front's general strike, revolution broke out in Spain. It was caused by General Franco's attempt to overthrow the young Spanish Republic. His push failed, and civil war began. Just like the French workforce, these militants from Barcelona marched with raised fists to the front line against the fascists, to the sound of the International. But they belonged to another current of the working class movement, the anarchists. Spain was the only country where anarchists had their own mass organization, the political syndicalist CNT-FAI. Anarchism and communism had been brothers at war since the 19th century. Communists were inspired by Marx and wanted to seize state control in order to build socialism. Anarchists were inspired by Bakunin and conversely wanted to destroy the state as well as existing social order. To achieve this, everything was permitted: general strikes, terrorist attacks, but also what anarchists called proletarian shopping. In other words, looting shops, not paying in restaurants, and robbing banks. And finally, contrary to Marxists who believed in a centralized economy planned from above, anarchists pursued the perennial anarcho-syndicalist dream of workers' self-governance. All would be well if there were no more bosses, and if the factories could be managed by the workers themselves. Catalonia, and in particular the large industrial city of Barcelona, was the heart of the Spanish anarchist movement. The anarchists were made up, of the most part, of the fragile workforce severely threatened by unemployment and economic crises. Many of them had come from the poorest regions of Spain, and these migrants lived together in barrios, new districts on the edge of the city. Only tiny parts of this anarchist Barcelona still remain, resisting the gentrification of the city. And when they disappear, the memory of the struggles will go with them.
Oíd mortales el grito sagrado de anarquía y solidaridad. Oír el ruido de bombas que estallan en defensa de la libertad. El obrero que sufre y proclama la anarquía del mundo al través. Coronada su sien de laureles y a sus plantas rendido el burgués, y a sus plantas rendido el burgués.
One of the most famous episodes of anarchist saga took place at the beginning of the 1930s, in the Spanish Pyrenees, around 100 kilometers north of Barcelona. The Count of Figos, whose disused castle now serves as a backdrop for wedding photos, owned large coal mines nearby. The miners, who came from poor Spanish rural areas and lived in mining villages on the slopes of the mountain, could be exploited at will. The vast majority were anarchists, and their revolt began in January 1932, proclaiming libertarian communism, convinced that the rest of Spain would follow. Office of the Revolutionary Committee. These are paltry images from a now legendary episode. After 5 days of uprising, the army intervened and the miners, with no leaders or strategies, surrendered. 40 miners were arrested and deported to Africa and the Canary Islands without trial. But for the anarchist leaders, the failure was unimportant. They saw it as training, what they called revolutionary gymnastics, getting the masses used to overcoming their fear of the police and the army. In July 1936, when General Franco brought about a civil war in Spain, the militant anarchists believed that the time for social revolution had finally come. Driven on by this impetus, more than 3,000 factories in the city of Barcelona alone were collectivized and put under the control of workers' councils elected by the workforce. The restaurant of the Big Ritz Hotel became self-governed and was transformed into a military canteen. Self-governed factories, too, produced arms and ammunition for the battlefront and food for the soldiers and the general population. Hairdressers, hospitals, electricity suppliers, and transport also became self-governed. But it wasn't long before the self-governing ideal came up against harsh reality. To enable a modern city of 1 million inhabitants to live, as well as producing for the front line, the movement needed leaders to organize, command, and control an obedient, diligent workforce. From the outset, the factories and offices that were self-governed collectively with the CNT and the Communist Union UGT were faced with a drop in productivity, absenteeism, and demands for better hours and wages. The militants blamed this resistance to work on the influence of the middle classes and sought to re-educate the masses by imposing new factory regulations, which bore an eerie resemblance to the old capitalist ones. Some of the rules, drawn up by workers' councils, even went as far as banning singing during working hours. The war effort took priority. Workers' emancipation would have to wait. Women's emancipation, too. It was nevertheless called for by the anarchist collective of Free Women, defending issues such as professional training, sexuality, education, and sexual equality. But this desire for autonomy was not supported by the anarchist leaders, for whom the social revolution had to come first, and the emancipation of women would automatically follow. In the meantime, the CNT films showed women knitting while men trained with fake rifles, since both France and Britain refused to supply them with real firearms. Franco's troops, on the other hand, were supplied directly by Hitler and Mussolini. The workers' movement was the only one to mobilize. Militants from around the world signed up for international brigades and traveled to Spain to fight fascism. But enthusiasm alone was not enough to save the Republic, which had been weakened by conflicts between moderates, communists, and anarchists. The war ended in 1939 with a victory for the Frankists. The fighting had caused 500,000 deaths, and the same number of Republicans fled into exile. At the Institute of Labor History in Seraing in Belgium, there's a small statue of an International Brigade volunteer with a raised fist. This was one more defeat for the workers, and the prologue to the next major catastrophe. Keith Gildart in Manchester, historian and ex-miner. He comes from a family of miners dating back to his great-grandfather and including his own father and uncle, an active militant in the NUM, the National Union of Miners.
His widow now, she's 91 years old. So I was asking her about what was it like growing up in mining communities. It was quite surprising, the fact that how little she talked about formal politics. So she talked a lot about how difficult it was raising children on, kind of low income in the 1930s and 1940s. And also about women's lives more generally, what they did in their spare time. And she talked a lot about cinema, about dance halls, about gossip, and also the micro dramas of the domestic sphere, the tensions between miners and miners' wives, which miners or family members coming in drunk from the public house every night, gambling too much, domestic violence, heavy drinking. So there's a dark side to mining communities and working class communities. The strife, the poverty, the conflicts, the violence. It's something I think is not written about enough, really, in terms of mining communities, because it's masked by this heroic image of the working class.
The conflicts between different nationalities was another aspect of this dark side which plagued the working classes in the 1930s. In 1934, at Le Forest in the north of France, French miners were violently opposed to and refused to support the strike led by their Polish immigrant co-workers. 77 Polish miners were then expelled and sent back to Poland. In a more systematic fashion, between 1934 and 1935, the French government organized the expatriation of about 130,000 Poles, criticized for anything and everything, such as social unrest, unemployment, and the economic crisis. Workers from the poorest countries crossed Europe in search for a better life. The poverty gaps were huge, whereas age-old misery still reigned in regions such as the Borinage, Silesia, and Catalonia. Skilled workers elsewhere were beginning to benefit from better work and life conditions. There were some spectacular successes, such as the Van Nel Museum in Rotterdam. It was built in 1930 and took inspiration from American Fordism. A combination of streamlining of production and improvements in the workplace were supposed to bring about new rises in productivity. Female workers had their own toilet blocks with fittings imported from the US. The canteen was bathed in light, which conveniently also helped improve surveillance. But these were exceptional, isolated initiatives from enlightened bosses, or in the case of social housing, from left-wing city councils, such as the huge modern Karl Marx complex, built in 1929 by the Socialist Council in Vienna, comprising 1,382 workers' apartments. Nazi Germany was the only nation to claim to have a systematic policy aiming to guarantee the well-being of its workers. The symbol of this was the people's car, the Volkswagen, launched by the regime in 1937. Historian Thomas Lindenberger.
Denken Sie an so ein Versprechen wie jeder Deutsche wird ein Autofahrer werden, also ein Besitzer eines individuellen PKWs, was in den 20er Jahren noch eine völlig utopische Vorstellung war und plötzlich zum Greifen nahe schien in den 30er und 40er Jahre. Und das richtete sich ganz gezielt an die Aufstiegserwartungen und Hoffnungen der anständigen Arbeiter, die über mehrere Generationen lang auf diesen Aufstieg auch schon gehofft hatten, enttäuscht worden waren durch verschiedene Wechselfälle, Erster Weltkrieg, Weltwirtschaftskrise und so weiter, und nun hofften, erstens, es kommt eine stabile Zeit, und zweitens, damit kommt dann auch der Wohlstand in einer Weise, wie er für viele möglich ist. Denken Sie daran, eines der populärsten Bücher in Deutschland, was man fast in jedem Haushalt finden konnte, war damals Henry Ford, Mein Leben. Und da wurde das schon im Kleinen beschrieben, wie sowas gehen könnte. Henry Ford war ein sehr wohlgelittener Autor bei den Nazis, weil das durchaus mit solchen volksgemeinschaftlichen Vorstellungen sich verbinden ließ. Und jeder konnte das kaufen, lesen und sagen, okay, da soll es jetzt hingehen. Das war ein sehr attraktives Versprechen.
The nefarious marriage of Fordism and Nazism spawned a vast project of conquest. In order to guarantee the prosperity of the country and its workers, Germany decided it needed to occupy the whole European continent and colonize it in the same way as Europe had colonized Africa and Asia for centuries. Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, and the following year, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, and the year after that, the Soviet Union. In all these occupied countries, Germany plundered industries, resources, and especially the workforce, of which there was a chronic shortage due to the military effort. The result of this hunt for workers was that towards the end of the war, around 7 million foreigners were working in Germany. The better off ones were the Dutch, Belgians, French, and Czechs. Some of them were volunteers, but most of them were enlisted for compulsory work service. They joined ordinary British and French prisoners of war, although officers were exempt. At the other end of the scale, the Slav population, made up of Poles, Ukrainians, and Russians, was considered subhuman. Over 600,000 war prisoners were grossly overworked, starved, and virtually treated as slaves. And even beneath them were the gypsies and the Jews, the political and racial deportees. Those who weren't immediately killed were left to die, literally, of exhaustion. The Nazis called it extermination through labor. This is a stone quarry at the Mauthausen camp. The camps were guarded by the SS, but in the large factories and offices, it was the German workers themselves who were in charge of disciplining recalcitrant foreigners. Historian Stefan Berger.
There is clear evidence that in the war, many German workers benefited from the enslavement of roughly 7 million foreign workers, because the existence of this army of slave laborers meant that German workers often had the opportunities of progressing in the hierarchy of the factory order, becoming foreman or having better positions and better pay. And I think that is something where the German workers benefited from the racism of the regime, and where they also often bought into the racism of the regime, because of course they needed to justify to themselves what they were doing, and the racism of the regime was a kind of handy explanation that they could use in order to justify what was going on.
In the mining regions of France and Belgium, memories of the great conflicts of the 1930s were still fresh in the mind, in spite of the German occupation. In the spring of 1941, 200,000 miners downed tools on both sides of the border. It was the biggest strike of the whole of the Second World War. Dozens of striking workers were shot dead, and hundreds deported to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. More than half of them never returned. After German troops invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, communists took over the leadership of the resistance to the occupying power. Strike. Propaganda. Sabotage. Armed struggle. In Italy, the major turning point came in the summer of 1943, when the Allies landed in the south and brought down the fascist government, pushing the Germans back up to the industrial north. A large number of workers at the Terni Steelworks joined up with the Communist Partisan Brigade, who were based in the mountain regions. Among them was Dante Bartolini, who wrote the brigade's anthem.
Operai e contadini, tutti uniti lotteremo all'appello di Stalin, siamo I primi partigiani.
When the war ended in 1945 with the defeat of the Nazis and fascists, the Partisan Brigade, who were chiefly communists, decided it was the right time to take things even further. Alfredo Filipponi, military commander of the Gramsci Brigade, recounts a discussion that he had with Palmiro Togliatti, the head of the Italian Communist Party.
Noi volevamo fare la liberazione nazionale dal fascismo e poi dopo con la speranza di arrivare al socialismo, che quello non ci siamo arrivati. Poi con Bagno Togliatti convocò tutti I comandanti dei partigiani e tutti I dirigenti del partito di tutta l'Italia. Fece un intervento, che c'erano le elezioni, in particolare diceva che c'è una grande ascendenza, voi lo sapete, fu vedere da fare perché doveva vincere le elezioni. Hanno parlato, sì, ho alzato la mano, compagno Togliatti, io non mi trovo d'accordo. Perché Omega? Non mi trovo d'accordo perché Lenin disse, quando passa il tordo bisogna tirargli. Se non si tira quando passa non si sa quando si può più tirare. Oggi passa il tordo ed allora questo è il momento. Noi le armi abbiamo nascoste, no? È il momento, gli diamo giù e facciamo il socialismo. Lui mise la proposta mia e la proposta sua all'approvazione, la sua ebbe 4 voti più della mia e passò la sua.
This partisan chief's authentic account is all the more fascinating because the proverb attributed to Lenin is actually an old peasant proverb from the Terni region. Historian Alessandro Potelli.
Questa cosa ha detto Lenin, che quando passa il tordo è il momento di sparargli. Fra l'altro è meraviglioso perché la cultura dell'Italia, di questa parte comunista dell'Italia rossa, toscana, umbria, sono tutti cacciatori. Il socialismo, il proverbio, Lenin, la caccia, stanno tutti insieme. Questa è la... E devo dire quello che è stato distrutto nell'ultimo paio di generazioni. Questo è il radicamento di un'idea di società alternativa nell'esperienza vissuta del mondo popolare, della classe operaia.
Berlin, 1945. Who would have thought that it would be in this ruined city that the ambitious dream of the Italian partisans to establish socialism would come true? In 1952. Workers on a building site in East Berlin are admiring the apartment block constructed for them by the new socialist regime, put in place by the Soviet Union. This elegant, modern and refined building, designed by the architect Hermann Henselmann, was merely a prototype which would not be developed. But the government replicated this image on monumental murals as a symbol of the promises made to the working classes. Promises of new material well-being, but also of a new status. Workers at last becoming masters of their lives in a workers' state. Simultaneously, just a stone's throw away, Bertolt Brecht was staging the struggles of the Russian proletariat under Tsarism.
Wir brauchen nicht nur den Flicken, wir brauchen den ganzen Rock. Wir brauchen nicht nur das Stück Brot, wir brauchen den Brotleib selbst. Wir brauchen nicht nur den Arbeitsplatz, wir brauchen die ganze Fabrik und die Kohle und das Erz ihr uns an? So, das ist, was wir brauchen. Aber was bietet ihr uns an?
Also Streik.
If the workers in East Berlin had had modern technology at their disposal, they would have stopped the film and rewound it to hear again the strange word, strike.
Also Streik.
In theory, it was a word no longer supposed to be part of their vocabulary. Striking was still permitted in capitalist countries, but on the other side of the Iron Curtain, it was considered absurd. The working classes were now in power, people said, and so they couldn't possibly strike against themselves. And if workers in one of these nominally socialist countries rebelled and made demands, as in the old days, then they would be put back in their place. As the Czech communist leader Zapatosky said, it's not because you're a worker that anything goes. And significantly, during marches in support of the workers' state, it was no longer their fists they held in the air, but portraits of their leaders. The official press nicknamed Prime Minister Zapatosky the father of all workers. In a radio address in 1952, he wished their children a happy Christmas.
Malý Ježíšek, ležící ve chlévě, nad chlevem zářící betlémská hvězda, to byl symbol starých Vánoc. Proč? Měl připomínat pracujícím a bědným, že chudí patří do chléva. Tak mluvili bohatí a mocní. Doby se ale změnily. Nastaly mnohé převraty. I Ježíšek vyrostl, zestaral, narostly mu vousy a stává se z něho Děda Mráz. Děda Mráz přijíždí k nám od východu a na cestu mu září také hvězdy. Nejen jediná betlémská, celá řada rudých hvězd na našich šachtách, hutích, továrnách a stavbách. Tyto rudé hvězdy hlásají radostně, že vaši tatínkové a maminky splnili na svých pracovištích úkoly 4. roku první Gottwaldovy pětiletky.
But workers in socialist countries no longer believed in Father Christmas. In 1953 in East Berlin, there was a revolt against an increase in working hours with no increase in salaries. The workers' uprising was crushed by Soviet tanks, filmed by journalists from West Berlin. In a moment of lucidity, Bertolt Brecht offered this solution. Wouldn't it be simpler, he wrote, for the government to just dissolve the people and elect a new one? There was no foreign press in Poznan in socialist Poland in June 1956. Only police officers secretly taking photos of striking workers in the Stalin locomotive works. We want bread, just like in the 19th century. The strike escalated into insurrection and the Polish army had to intervene. 57 people died, most of them workers. It was workers once again on the front line 4 months later, when revolution broke out in Hungary. They were the first to take up arms, calling for democracy. For Soviet troops to leave, and for power to be given to workers' councils and factories. Workers were the last to give up their arms when the Soviet army came in and crushed the uprising, causing 3,000 deaths. Hungary, 1956, was the last time European workers took up arms to demand their rights. Whereas in the East, tanks were sent in to subdue rebellious workers, in the West, workers were pacified by all the material comforts, including their own car, that they could now afford thanks to a rise in their standard of living.
È il momento in cui nelle case operaie per la prima volta sono in grado di mettere un lampadario con le gocce di cristallo, che noi borghesi consideriamo di pessimo gusto, perché noi borghesi pensiamo a specialmente a quei tempi, no? Lo stile svedese, lineare, sobrio, cioè. Le case operaie sono sovrarredate, no? Ninnoli, perché lui dice, io sono cresciuto che in casa avevi una lampadina appesa al muro come quelli che adesso stanno nelle stalle. Cioè, il superfluo diventa un elemento di rivendicazione di dignità, no? Il pauperismo è una cosa che la manifesti se te lo puoi permettere. Io nel caffè non prendo zucchero, ma quando andavo a fare le interviste automaticamente mi mettevano 3 cucchiaini di zucchero nel caffè. Perché? Ma perché era un modo di dire, guarda che possiamo anche permetterci di metterti lo zucchero.
1963. French workers are hearing some good news on television. Working-class districts, they are told, are being replaced by apartment blocks where a factory assembler can live alongside a salesman, an engineer, or a senior manager. And in the holiday resorts on the Mediterranean coast, young metalworkers can share their Tahitian-style chalets with the daughters of factory owners. And for the very first time, workers are told that the working class no longer existed. Nevertheless, this was the heyday of the French working class. A workforce of 8 million people, 37% of the French population. But its makeup had changed. The majority in the buses transporting Peugeot workers in Sochaux were OS, specialized workers. They were the least qualified workers and the most exploited. Young men, immigrants, and women, cannon fodder for the assembly lines. They became the most radical elements in the workers' uprisings of 1968. Contrary to popular opinion, the revolts did not spring up unexpectedly in a lethargic France. Serious strikes and violent clashes with police had taken place over the course of the previous year. But in May and June 1968, the country was brought to a halt by the movement of strikes. The power of the workforce was asserting itself, just like in 1936, with added violence. The difference with the situation in 1936 was that the radical workers of 1968 faced off with a right-wing government. On June 11th in Sochaux, clashes between the CRS and strikers led to the death of 2 workers. There were other images as well.
Une femme de la ZUP, par exemple, raconte, elle était gamine, elle avait 15 ans, elle descendait voir son père qui était sur les barricades à Sochaux, et il y avait la ZUP n'était pas construite, donc il n'y avait pas de bloc, et les pâtures descendaient pratiquement jusqu'à l'usine, et il y avait un paysan qui était là, qui avait fauché, qui avait laissé sa faux dans un arbre, et il l'avait pendu. Et les CRS couraient derrière les gamines, et il y en a un qui a empoigné la faux. Et son souvenir à elle, c'est de voir, se rappeler du CRS qui courait derrière avec la faux dans la main. On dirait, tu sais, la peste au Moyen-Âge, tu sais, non mais voilà, ce genre de témoignage, mais en fait, tu te dis, voilà, c'était ça. Hein. Moi, j'ai d'autres copines, là, qui avaient 15-16 ans, et qui, il n'y avait plus d'école, il n'y avait plus rien, venaient à la sortie de l'usine, aller dans la rivière, donc il y avait la Lan à côté, ramasser les cailloux avec des seaux et les remonter au père qui les balançait sur la gueule des CRS. C'est des trucs comme... Et on voit bien le groupe ouvrier, comment il était constitué très différemment maintenant, quoi. Voilà, c'était... tout le monde participait parce que c'était normal, c'était pas... Voilà, c'était des choses normales.
Here's a factory in France being occupied at the end of the 1970s. It was a time of disobedience in the workplace, the rejection of factory organization with all its constraints, talks between employers and union leaders. At the Lippe watchmakers factory in Besançon in eastern France, the conflict went on for years. The female workers reinvented self-government. They started production up again and became self-employed. And they started speaking out about it.
Dans mon secteur, je travaillais avec des hommes. Rien que des hommes. Il n'y a pas longtemps qu'il y a une femme qui est avec moi. C'était rien que des hommes. Mais les régleurs, c'était des hommes jeunes. J'aimais bien, je les aimais bien, parce ils n'ont pas la mentalité déjà des vieux. Des gentils. Puis il y en avait un, enfin c'était un de mes chefs. Je l'aimais mieux, celui-là. Malgré que c'était mon chef, malgré que je n'aime pas les cadres, malgré... J'ai une adversité encore en plus pour eux. Oui, c'est établi quelque chose entre nous qui fait qu'on s'aimait bien. Bon, mais par la suite, ça s'est développé ça, et finalement, oui, je l'ai beaucoup aimé, cet homme-là, je l'aime encore beaucoup. Mais, dans le conflit, c'est un cadre. Et je le déteste. Parce qu'il ne se bat pas, parce qu'il reste tranquille chez lui avec les centaines et les centaines de mille francs de paye qu'il a. Et je voudrais pouvoir dissocier les deux. L'homme que j'aime, que je connais, qui est gentil, qui est prévenant, c'est un homme pour moi, là. Hein? Il a des conversations bien, et alors, quand on le voit de l'autre côté, c'est... Je le déteste, je ne peux pas dire un autre mot.
The era of the workers' revolt ended in a major historical event. It took place against all odds in socialist Poland, at the Lenin shipyards of Gdańsk. Workers had gone on strike led by crane operator Anna Valentinovich and electrician Lech Walesa in order to be able to create a free trade union independent from the ruling party. This was absolutely unheard of in the Soviet bloc. The new trade union quickly attained 10 million members. It was spokesman Karol Modzelewski, a dissident historian, who came up with the name Solidarność, meaning solidarity.
C'était une révolution. On ne pouvait pas se tromper là-dessus. On s'est senti comme un personnage du tableau de Delacroix. La liberté qui conduit le peuple aux barricades. C'est un état d'âme de grand nombre de millions de personnes, de grandes masses, qui quittent leur attitude conformiste de tous les jours pour devenir les souverains de leur propre destin, et de leur propre usine, de leurs propres camarades, de leur propre pays. Maintenant, quand je suis vieux, je me rends compte que la révolution est soit impossible, soit elle tourne mal. Un révolutionnaire ne doit pas le savoir. Son ignorance lui donne des ailes, oui, et elle lui fournit des forces nécessaires pour demander et obtenir l'impossible.
All Poles at the time were aware of the images of Soviet tanks in August 1968 crushing the Prague Spring protest movement, which had been an attempt to bring democratic reforms to Czechoslovakia. The only question in Polish minds was if and when it would be their turn, and if the tanks would be Soviet or Polish ones. They were Polish. On December 13, 1981, General Jaruzelski decreed martial law. Solidarność was banned and its leaders imprisoned. Around 100 factories went on strike. Workers occupied the factory floors, but the army's tanks crashed through the walls of the buildings, causing unarmed strikers to flee. They had no other choice than to give up the fight and return to work the next day.
Après, il y avait des manifestations de rue. Mais c'est tout différent. La manifestation de rue chacun y est séparé. Il n'y a pas de sujet collectif. Les manifestants, c'est une foule. Une fois la manifestation terminée, la foule se disperse. Et rien ne lie plus, dans le futur, les participants de cette foule entre eux. Ils ne sont plus la collectivité, la communauté. Pour être capable à la grève, il faut être en communauté. Si la communauté cesse d'exister, fini. C'est fini.
3 years after the youngest major trade union was crushed in the Eastern Bloc, it was the turn of the oldest one in the West to be defeated. The NUM, the British National Union of Miners, launched a huge strike in 1984 with the aim of preventing the closure of 20 pits. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had been waiting for this opportunity to reduce the power of British trade unions. After a year-long confrontation, 11,000 arrests and 200 convictions, the miners, having run out of funds, returned to work, having obtained nothing. Socialism and ultraliberalism were for once unified in their hatred of workers' autonomy. Thereafter, it only remained for the Berlin Wall to collapse.
How did you decide to become a historian of the working class?
I think that's probably down to my dad. My dad worked on the track in British Leyland, in what was then Standard Triumph back in the day. My dad would come back home with stories of what it was like to work on the track. And at one level, you could really get a sense of how much he enjoyed work. He was a bit of a workaholic. He always did overtime. But at another level, another layer of my dad's work experience was certainly alienation. Working on a mind-numbing production track in the car industry. But I think ever since that time, I've been trying to understand my father's life as a blue-collar worker, what work meant to him, and also what the loss of work meant to him. He was made redundant from that particular factory, aged 45. He's a young man, and spent the last years of his life in insecure, precarious jobs, taxi driving for a while. Ended up as a cleaner in a factory, and you could almost, you could sense that kind of deterioration and degradation, and what it meant also to lose work, and the rupture, the rupture that went along with my father being made redundant, being thrown on the scrap heap, as he would have said.
Put on the scrap heap. This has been the fate of tens of thousands of European workers since the 1970s. It was when companies started to desert the major regions that had been at the heart of the Industrial Revolution, with their aging technology and militant workforce. And they started to take on workers from Central and Eastern Europe who were more docile and accepted lower pay. The same scarred landscapes could be seen all over, in some cases converted into tourist sites. Strange memorials celebrating both the exploitation as well as the pride of the workers. Like this huge German steelworks closed in 2004 and transformed into a museum. At the foot of this tall blast furnace, there are footprints, undoubtedly placed there to guide the visitors. But it's impossible not to think about those who used to walk on this factory floor. This is a small shoemaking factory in Romont, in the south of France. It's still surviving, but in the workshop, most of the machines have shut down and the chairs are empty. Yet this image is deceptive. Workers in France still represent a fifth of the active population, but they've become invisible scattered around, split up, devalued, or uberized, as the phrase goes. It's their identity that has disappeared, an identity that became a conscience, and a conscience that became a strength.
Les gens ne se définissent plus comme prolétaires. Ils se définissent comme, même plus trop comme ouvriers. Ils se définissent comme le poste auquel ils sont affectés. Donc ça peut être ceux de la crevette, ceux du poisson, au sein de la même usine, ceux du dépotage, ceux du chargement, ceux de la congélation, ceux du poisson pané. À l'abattoir, c'est ceux du cochon, ceux du bœuf, ceux de la coupe, ceux du désossage, ceux de la tuerie, ceux des abats. T'as même pas au sein de la même usine cette idée de dire on est tous dans la même galère.
Ernesto De Martino, che è il nostro grande antropologo, racconta una volta che andando in Calabria prendono in macchina un contadino del posto per indicargli la strada, e quando questo contadino si accorge che non vede più il campanile del suo paese va in panico. Ecco, qui è scomparso il campanile, che magari era l'Unione Sovietica, che era meglio che, no? O che era il partito, o che era la fabbrica. È scomparso il campanile e siamo tutti nelle condizioni di quel contadino lì, no? Operai e non operai.
Pour moi, c'est encore un mythe, ou du moins la mémoire d'un mythe.
L'ouvrier.
Oui.
Mythe représentant quoi?
Pardon?
Un mythe qui représente quoi?
Un mythe qui représente l'incarnation des gens opprimés et des gens qui sont porteurs de l'espoir de changement qui va éliminer la pression. Mais si vous voulez, c'est la profession des foi révolutionnaires du XXe siècle, peut-être. Je ne sais pas, est-ce que la classe ouvrière va se reconstituer? Elle est maintenant en disparition. En disparition, peut-être pas définitive, peut-être pas totale, mais quand même en disparition. Ça pose des problèmes. Sa disparition pose des problèmes très sérieux à nous autres, les êtres humains, partout. Parce que le monde automatisé pose des problèmes. Le monde globalisé pose des problèmes, sérieux problèmes. Mais je ne sais pas vous dire plus parce que je ne suis pas prophète. Et je ne veux pas être prophète.